this is a session that I am particularly delighted about because it touches on two topics and two issues that have recently really surfaced as highly relevant. Not that they haven't been relevant before, of course, but in the public discourse, they have become more important. Intersectionality, as well as collective healing. And probably both of those you've heard about in certain contexts. However, bringing them together is actually a really interesting and important avenue. And I couldn't think of a better person to guide us through that than Akosua Adomako Ampofo, who is also a professor of African and gender studies at the University of Ghana, and describes herself as a scholar activist. And that combination is always intriguing. And I am so looking forward to and pleased to introduce her and this topic of intersectionality, a pathway to collective healing, for our spotlight session today. So I'll turn it right over to you, Akosua.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jorg, so much for having me for this session, which I'm also excited about sharing with everyone. It's also a pathway of growth for me as well. So thank you for having me to share these reflections. So let me start by saying that unless there's a genuine belief in mutual learning, efforts at communal healing that you referred to will be meaningless. And so I want to believe that I'm speaking to those of shared faith who want to be leaders. We're talking about inclusive leaders who want to be inclusive leaders who can offer hope that can build us up. That's the starting point, at least the willingness and the shared willingness that this is something that we need to do and can do. To say that we live in, and slide 2, please. To say that we live in tempestuous and unsettling times, it's almost a cliche, really. And it's true that as human beings, we've always lived with pain and trauma. And the slide, reflects some of our realities of today. But I guess that we've not lived with them at this level of global sharing in real time. You cannot avoid the bleeps, the tinkles, the prods. The internet and technology have enabled a level of global sharing at breakneck speed in real time that we haven't experienced, in the decades before. According to Statista, an independent research and data analysis organization, issues related to the economy were the most worrying topic worldwide as of September of this year, September 2022. Taking a harvest from their website as well as other sources, the following are the most pressing issues of global concern, according to researchers, in no particular order. If we could have the next slide, slide 3, please. So cobbled together, what we have are inflation, poverty, social inequality and unemployment, racism and discrimination, including issues of immigration control and borders, crime, violence and police brutality, climate change and the environment, sexual violence in particular, COVID-19 and all that it brought with, travel borders, medicine and pharmaceutical and science borders, the discrimination against peoples from certain parts of the world. Mental ill health is a big one. Knowledge and education, reparations, repatriations, and restitutions. So I'll not offer the chilling data on most of the above because I'm sure we've all lived with them and been affected by them directly or vicariously through someone we care about or know. Rehashing them can also be triggering, even though to talk and to walk towards healing, we have to recognize specific areas of pain. We cannot bury the pain. I'd like to single out 2 for special mention from where I sit that are closely related. And I select these not to elicit guilt, but because they are less recognized or understood, and also they form very important aspects of the pathway to collective healing in our multicultural and multiracial world. So the two that I'm picking on before I go on with my remarks are knowledge production, and then the issue of reparations, repatriations, and restitution. So let me start with the second. Germany made its last debt payment, I read, for the damages of World War II on October 3rd, 2010. This was the 20th anniversary of German reunification. At the time, West Germany, they also agreed to, at the time that then West Germany agreed to restitution after the Holocaust, a major component was the payment of $7 billion at the time, calculated at that time. And it was agreed to give the then young state of Israel, the equivalent of that amount of money. By 1961, Israel's GNP had tripled during the 12 years of that agreement. And the Bank of Israel attributed 15% of this growth over that period, along with 45,000 jobs, to investments that they made with the money that they got from reparations from West Germany. But that was actually only a tiny fraction of Germany's total reparations payments, which by one account totaled nearly 89 billion as of 2012. And most of that money went to individual survivors. Apartheid, another area where restitution was called for. And one of the duties of South Africa's post-apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in addition to scrutinizing human rights abuses committed by the apartheid government, was recommending reparations and other policies to redress those abuses and the crimes that were committed under the former regime. The commission recommended about 360 million to be paid in reparations and to be distributed in 6 annual payments to victims identified by the commission. But in 2003, the South African government announced that it will authorize only 85 billion to be given in one-time payments of 3,900. So I'm sorry, 360 billion were to be paid, and the South African government agreed to pay 85 billion. The recipients formed only a tiny fraction of the actual number of people victimized by the apartheid regime. Japanese internment, another. The forced internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps during World War II resulted in about 3.1 billion in property loss and about 6.5 billion in income loss, calculated at 2014 dollars. And this did not, of course, count the losses from possible investments of those monies. The US Congress made 2 attempts at reparations: the Japanese American Claims Act of 1948 and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Between 1948 and 1965, the former authorized payments totaling 38 million, which didn't come close to matching the economic loss. And the latter offered survivors $20,000 each in reparations. By 1998, 80,000 survivors had collected their share for a total payout of 1.6 billion. This is under around $3 billion calculated at today's money. There's no accounting by which either measure could adequately repay these victims for their economic losses. But some compensation was paid. We can talk about forced sterilization, which has happened in certain parts of the world. We can talk about the Tuskegee experiment that was carried out against African-American men in prison in the United States. And on that list can go. The urgency of the question of historical, environmental, and transgenerational justice requires that anyone interested in communal healing must address in a multidisciplinary, intersectional, and uncompromising manner the burning issues of reparation, restitution, repatriation, and justice when it comes to the circulation of knowledges, spiritualities, works of art, but more specifically also the erasure and confiscation of cultural and intangible heritage that was snatched away during the colonial period. So reparations are really the act or process of making amends for a wrong. In addition to the economic losses from looting a people's artifacts, they are the feelings of identity loss that can destroy the soul of a nation. The Benin bronzes, for example, are a group of sculptures that include elaborately decorated cast plaques, commemorative heads, animal and human figures, items of royal regalia, and personal ornaments. They were created from at least the 16th century onwards and were found in the West African kingdom at that time of Benin and created by specialist guilds working on behalf of the court of the king of Oba of the Benin city. The kingdom also supported guilds working in other materials such as ivory, leather, coral, and wood, and the term Benin bronzes is sometimes used to refer to all of these objects. Many pieces were commissioned specifically for the ancestral altars of past Obas and queen mothers. They were also used in other rituals to honor the ancestors and to validate the accession of a new Oba to the throne. Among the most well-known of the Benin bronzes are the cast brass plaques, which once decorated the Benin Royal Palace and which provide an important historical record of the Kingdom of Benin. This includes dynastic history as well as social history and insights into relationships with neighboring kingdoms, states, and societies. The Benin bronzes are preceded by earlier West African cast brass traditions dating back into the medieval period. 3,000 to 5,000 artifacts, which is a rough count, were taken from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897 when British soldiers attacked and occupied Benin City as Britain expanded its political and commercial influence in West Africa. The British Museum alone holds more than 900 objects from Benin, and national museums in Scotland hold another 74. Others were distributed to museums around the world by the British. In a joint ceremony in October 2002, the National Gallery of Art and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art, both in the US, collectively transferred ownership of 30 of these so-called Benin bronzes to the people of Nigeria. I say so-called because they were not all necessarily bronzes, but fall under that category. Recently, the Democratic Republic of Congo has seen a symbolic restitution of the tooth of Pan-Africanist and nationalist political leader, Prime Minister Emery Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated in a conspiracy, the consortium of Western imperialist states at the time, in the aftermath of the independence of African countries, when there was resistance to the changes that Lumumba was bringing into that country at the time. In the November 28 issue of the New York Times, Constant Mehiot has an article titled, I quote, "A Paris museum has 18,000 skulls. It's reluctant to say whose." She refers to the Museum of Manking, which according to critics is home to a vast collection of human remains that could help former colonies and descendants of conquered peoples get them back. The remains include those of African kings, Cambodian rebels, and indigenous people from Oceania, mostly gathered during France's colonial era, and the skulls of more than 200 Sioux and Avanjo peoples. This latter group forms one of the largest, if not the largest, known collection of human skulls. Details of the collection remain shrouded in secrecy. A confidential memo said that the collection included the bones of Mamadou Lamine, a 19th century West African Muslim leader who led a rebellion against French colonial troops, and a family of Inuits in what is now Canada that had been exhibited in a Paris human zoo as late as 1881. According to the author of this New York Times article, over the past 2 decades, only 50 sets of remains, these human remains, have been returned. And yet funeral and burial ceremonies are important phases of healing, recovery, and moving forward. Return of human remains is a priority for many, even more so than the remains of looted objects valued in billions of dollars. Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium have developed some protocols for the return of human remains that are not nearly as complex as for objects. The objects typically require, lots of paperwork and bureaucracy, but with human remains, basically what these countries are asking for is some proof of an ancestral connection. The Smithsonian and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, according to this article, have begun conversations about returning the remains of enslaved people that they hold. France, however, has a complex and time-consuming method that requires the applicants, according to this New York Times article, to show provenance research and has strict guidelines for return. There have been several reports by French researchers recommending ways to simplify the process. However, it would appear that political will is lacking. A Senate proposal in France to establish a scientific advisory board on restitutions and to examine a bill passed by the Senate in January 2002 that will remove the need for Parliament to approve every restitution request remains unattended to. When it comes to knowledge production, we can talk about how knowledge from certain parts of the world has been buried, infantilized, or appropriated, leading not only to financial loss, but again, identity loss. Eminent scholars such as the African-American sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, the Ugandan feminist legal scholar Sylvia Tamale, the writers Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and the social scientists Ndlovu Gacheni have variously described this loss as being part of epistemic violence, destroying violence of other people's knowledge. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o in 1986 referred to this epistemic violence in terms of an invasion of the mental universe of colonized people, the removal of the hard disk of previous knowledge and memory, and downloading into people's minds the software of European knowledge and memory. This removal and replacement is linked to a second form of epistemic violence, which occurs when social scientific data on particular groups, peoples, the other, from the perspective of those doing that work, are interpreted to show them as a problem or as inferior. This often leads to savior interventions, quote unquote, that can actually do a lot of harm. And elsewhere, I have discussed in some detail how these forms of violence have extreme financial implications, because you don't get paid for the knowledge that you have contributed, which has been erased, and sometimes it's actually sold back to you in a new form that you then have to pay for. And we see this profoundly in the pharmaceutical industry, where so-called indigenous remedies are either trumpeted as folk medicine and buried, or are taken over by heavyweights for profit. A little anecdote here that may help us understand how this impacts identity, and also, as we say in my country, we use fish to catch fish. If your basket of fish is thrown to the side, then it means that bigger fish that you might catch are also lost. Greta Thunberg, the young environmental activist, is famous. She's also white and she's not poor. But how many people know Kaluki Paul Mutuku, the Kenyan climate advocate and environmental defender, or Leah Namugerwa, the 15-year-old Ugandan activist? These young African activists have been referred to in the media as the Greta Thunbergs of their country, or are said to be following in her footsteps, even in cases where, like Mutuku's, he began his public activism long before Greta Thunberg started hers. And this process is not benign, actually. I'm sure some who are listening are familiar with the story of Vanessa Nakate, the young Ugandan activist who appeared at a joint press conference in Davos in 2020 with other prominent climate activists like Greta Thunberg. And when the Associated Press published a picture of the event, Nakate had been cut from the image, which then showed only 4 white activists. And she had to actually, protest before the picture was pulled down. A new one was put up that included her. But tit for tat will not work. Young Black and brown activists lament that marginalized people are always called to give, bend, forgive. But the truth is that just like in the fictional kingdom of Wakanda in Black Panther, unless the closely held knowledge about the healing properties of vibranium are shared, we cannot move closer to building an emancipatory world for all. At the same time, unless we can see that there's an inherent oppression in how some knowledge and ways of knowing things are offered as a standard, against which other ways of knowing and other knowledges are measured, we cannot begin to dismantle all of us. As a scholar, for example, why must I cite the work of a well-known European or American sociologist to legitimize my work? But my grandmother's experiences cannot be cited because she's not known and they are not written. What makes oral history less legitimate? How does one become a knower? The failure to recognize and include all knowledges and cultures leads to ever-deepening inequality, which in turn means we are all at risk of finding ourselves in what the Akans of Ghana refer to as a state of the loss of personhood. And I'd like to pay tribute to scholars like Abraham, Jechi, and Wiredu from Ghana. They argue that you cannot be a whole person when you build who you are on the destruction of others, whether that destruction is conscious or inadvertent. This awareness of the interconnectedness and shared humanity requires a concerted effort to maintain equilibrium through a spirit of fairness and justice, including reciprocity. Could I have the next slide, please? And so I want to move on to comments towards healing. And just quote here from important ancestors of ours. Bell Hooks says that rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. So whatever we are struggling with, this attempt to find our healing alone will simply not work. The Akans have a saying, Benkum jari nifa, nifa jari benkum, which literally translated means the right hand washes the left hand washes the right. And I will come back to that. And Ubuntu is now popularized as this Southern African concept of recognizing that I can only be who I am when you are enabled to be who you are. So let me say, before I say a few words on intersectionality, I want to say something about fake news, because this is important in the conversation that we are having. Fueled by an industry that thrives on and even creates fake news, levels of anxiety are soaring. At one time or another, we have probably all come across a headline on social media and clicked like or shared a post without digesting the entire article or thinking critically about its contents. I confess that I have done this. And which ones do we share? Those that support our initial views or those that challenge them? It's our craving for quick reads, for hoorays from other people who are our fans, and for tabloid-style sensationalism that makes social media the platform of choice for manipulative narrators to package hidden agendas. Some people do this consciously, even if we don't. For them to spread propaganda and half-truths in neatly wrapped packages under the guise of legitimate news headlines. Fake news is not new, though. Traditional mainstream media have employed this tactic to increase circulation for years with their headlines, right? And then you read the story and it's like, wow, that headline didn't fit. The story doesn't even talk about what the headline says. But today it is spread by people like you and me. Information on social media doesn't have to be vetted. It doesn't have to be investigated or confirmed in order to spread. And like wildfire, it does spread destruction in its wake and leaves us angry and frustrated. And there are too many angry and frustrated people around the globe right now. Righteous anger, but sometimes built on stuff that isn't true or real. And sometimes that anger can have dire consequences. How and why does this spread happen? Much of it has to do with cultural cognition, right? Those of us who share certain stories typically identify strongly with that position or narrative that another person is sharing. And the story reflects how we see ourselves and how we see the world. And for most of us, it's not necessarily fake news. And when we share it, we see it as an act to confirm what we believe. We don't recognize our biases in this because we favor information that confirms our beliefs, and we seek to strengthen our points of view by sharing that information. And then after residing in this insular echo chamber where our beliefs are endorsed and validated by other members of the in-group, we can understand why such people, including ourselves, sometimes react so emotionally when someone with opposing views attempts to tear down the foundation blocks of our community. And we saw this so strongly in the COVID science wars, those who believed in one position or another and vaccination or not vaccination and so forth. In as much as the sharing of narratives that destroy is a community affair, rebuilding and healing must be a community affair. If we are to survive, move forward in any kind of journey of healing, wholeness, and reciprocal existence, we must recognize that healing is an act of communion. And it implies recognizing and making effort to feel other people's pain. And this further implies being intentional in our efforts to understand how inequality operates. We need to feel others' pain and build empathy and restoration into our work. Next slide, please. Scholars and activists, next slide, please. Yeah. Scholars and activists have long acknowledged that various forms of inequality are interlinked. Sorry, slide before, please go back one slide. Yes. So we recognize that various forms of inequality are interlinked, much less sometimes that various forms of power are also interlinked. Our ways of engaging with them intellectually, myself as a scholar and as an activist, and also personally, expose the extent of our own power, privilege, or lack thereof. And I may be disadvantaged in one context as a Black woman from the so-called global South. My sex, race, and global affiliation may disadvantage me somewhere else. At the same time, my status as a university professor, a senior citizen, a heterosexual or straight or cisgender woman, an Akan and a Christian in a country where the Akans and Christians dominate, offer me privilege based on ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and class. How do these intersections operate, and how do they travel across geopolitical contexts in time and space? Crenshaw, who is said to have coined the term intersectionality, acknowledges that it is not an attempt to create the world in an inverted image of what it is now, so that you flip the inequalities, but rather to make room for more advocacy and remedial practices. To recognize how these intersectionalities happen, how some people are empowered, how others are disempowered, so that we can do something about it and to create a more egalitarian world. We must recognize and accept that for all our competencies and experiences, we are only one set of actors in what Purkeyasta, the American scholar, calls transnational assemblages. And we must also consider collaborations as well as contestations between generations, between the local and the diasporic, between the elites and the grassroots, as places where contestations happen because of our different locations, but where also collaborations to move us forward can also happen. But that latter aspect has to be done consciously and intentionally. And so a full array of intersectional approaches must begin, or at least include, the perspectives and experiences of diverse groups. The languages, concepts, and questions must be built from what is real and familiar for the place and the people whose stories we are trying to surface, whose issues we are trying to address, and to allow for sufficient time for levels of trust and comfort to grow. If I want to engage a community and do what I think is healing and productive work, I need to allow time for trust to grow. I can't just parachute in with my do-good intentions. So how do I come to the questions that inform my work? How do we gauge our methods so that we can alleviate inequalities and lead to justice? Do we address the multidimensional character of inequalities? And if so, how? While we may recognize that we can simultaneously express privilege and disadvantage, and that this experience is context-driven, we, and I'm talking here about scholar activists like myself, we have paid less attention to the diverse ways in which the one can inform the other, right? How does my privilege inform my work of disadvantage? How does my experience of disadvantage help me to dismantle areas of privilege that I myself and others may encounter in other contexts? So I'm calling on us to reflect on how privilege and disadvantage can intersect, and how experiences of discrimination, favoritism, even trauma can enhance our work as humans, people who are intent on bringing healing into spaces filled with righteous anger often, but also destructive anger and frustration sometimes. How can our reflections and understandings serve as tools to enhance our work through an active focus on questions of in and exclusion, in-group versus out-group dynamics, and solidarity building? But first, we must position the posture of our souls. If I could have the final slide. We should thus, so when I say reposition the posture of our own souls, it means a lot of inward looking and introspection. Seeing myself maybe sometimes as a victim, but also locating myself in the scope of privilege and how I contribute to that either actively or through my silence. which should thus lead us to a spirit of walking in another's shoes. And so I position these three options for us here on the slide. Without receiving and offering grace, we cannot be human. Grace is that understanding that I have that I can only be well if you are well, Ubuntu, and I can only be well if you are well today. Or further citing the Akan proverb that I referred to earlier, Benkum Jare Nifa, the left hand washing the right and the right washing the left. Inherent in that is not just about reciprocity. That Akan saying calls us to remember our interconnectedness, both at the instrumental or practical level, as well as due to our spiritual connectedness. The proverb reminds us that what we share with each other, despite our diversity, is our humanity. It asserts intersectionality, that we come with different strengths, gifts, opportunities, as well as disadvantages and struggles, some divinely endowed, others a result of our privilege. The head start we had in life, or alternatively, the deliberate or inadvertent actions of others to disadvantage us, or the simple fact that the world is not fair. Some random things happen that, just don't work well for us, needs to be understood and appreciated. And so this notion of Benkum Jare Nifa, this reciprocity, asserts that at the same time, times change. So our context also changes. Nothing is guaranteed to us. There's a specificity in the moment that we are not guaranteed tomorrow. And so in this Akan cosmology, while there's an emphasis on hard work, and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, productivity, progress, and so on, there's also a recognition that some people are born without feet, so they're not going to be able to wear boots, let alone, have bootstraps to pull up, and that you can do something about that by recognizing that there are such people in your community. And even though you may not be able to give them boots, you can help them to walk, and you can also do things for them, which they will never be able to do because they do not have feet. It eliminates the posture of being a savior, because we give and receive as we acknowledge our privilege and mortality in the changing scenes of life. The value of what I can offer as a result of my class privilege, my ethnicity, or my technical knowledge is not measured purely in economic terms, because I recognize my interconnectedness with others, and that the act of giving puts me in a relational bond of mutual dependence. So how we understand, appreciate, and act on these bonds is context specific, changing across time and space. And we should not be fundamentalist about our methodologies and our understandings. How can we think about the common good and serving others in ways that are not patronizing, paternalistic, or colonial? How can we enact justice in the face of the severe economic, social, and political inequalities? Who will we collaborate with, and who will we refuse to collaborate with? These are questions that we have to consciously ask ourselves. What are we willing to risk for mutual healing to occur? I have recently decided that I will not attend a conference if others from my community cannot get visas to attend them. I have the privilege of having a European passport, which allows me passage across the world at will, but there are others from my community who do not have that privilege. And if they will not be allowed entry, I will, in solidarity, not enter either. Others have done this before us, risking, giving up so that the community can heal. In her book titled Wrestling with God, Cecilia Lynch describes the Harlan's Renaissance Christians who challenged white Christian complacency. Christian liberationists in South America have targeted the structural scaffolding of US military and economic interventions that brought violence and suffering to Latin America, while opposing Christian conservatives who legitimize these interventions. We cannot ignore power and its dynamics. And I gave these two examples because as a person of Christian faith, I see way too often the ways in which Christian communities today, many of them, have closed their eyes to many areas of global suffering. The more powerful advantaged in any circumstance are poorer if we do not fully enter into the suffering of others. Anytime we experience an inconvenience, a loss, we can walk in the shoes of others. These are opportunities to enter into the struggles that others have encountered and to infuse our own research practice with a recognition of our connectedness. And many times we can do this intentionally. And with time, maybe in the Q&A, I can share a personal experience of engaging in shared connectivity around a bill that has been called the Proper Human Sexualities Bill in my country, Ghana, that has sought to really restrict the citizenship rights of peoples from the queer community. So let me come to, by way of conclusion, and share, just reiterate these three areas that I refer to and that you can see on the slide: engaging in scenarios of disadvantage, inclusion and exclusion, and finding scenarios of these. I would love to workshop these three areas. Conscious reciprocity, where we can flip the script, we can consciously put ourselves in the other shoes and try to imagine and even role play. And sometimes people actually go into spaces and pretend to be somebody else just so that they can embody their areas of disadvantage. We can do this also through collaborations and sitting at the table to listen to the powerful. There are too many ways, I would say, where, we're again going back to the silos that we live in, where we refuse to listen or to understand the position or the positionality of the, if you like, quote unquote, oppressor, because we do not want to give the oppressor more voice than they already have. But oppressors are also not, there's diversity in the positionality of the oppressors. There is consciousness and there is the unconsciousness. And if we do not engage in conversations, we are not going to, we'll continue to do work with ourselves, for ourselves, and will not change that script. And finally, of course, advocacy and remedial practices. I mentioned the issue of, engaging in work around visas and border controls and so on. Refusing to travel may be a statement, but we need to also go beyond that to do, active advocacy work around the sites and locations where those kinds of activities occur. I would say, for example, in a country like Ghana, where recently I needed to attend a conference with one of my students, and this was in the US. She was given a visa appointment for sometime in 2023. And this conference was in November 2022, right? But of course, you pay the visa application fee and it's not returned to you. And so in a sense, this becomes really some kind of a scam where you know that the person is not going to be able to travel, but you've collected their money and it's not going to be given to that. And we can begin to imagine the amounts of money that some of these quote unquote international embassies make in countries where people are not going to be given visas to travel. So I just want to conclude by saying that there are a host of things that we can do consciously, and that things do not only have to be spontaneous in my heart. I can train myself, I can take specific actions, we can take specific actions together to bring about these changes that will allow us to live in a fairer world, that will allow us to engage in conversations about the issues that we are struggling and hurting with, that will allow us to begin little steps, because I think I've reached a point in my life where, changing the world is extremely utopian. It may have been okay for me to think this way as an 18-year-old. This is very unrealistic now. But, you doing what you are doing in your corner, I doing what I am doing in my corner, the little bits that we are doing together, sometimes consciously together, can bring about that collective healing as we hear each other's pain, listen to each other, and engage in specific actions locally and globally. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, because you laid out, I think, in such an important and big story. I'm just going to resonate a little bit with what you said before going to some questions that are coming through. But you laid out such an important story, right? You started with just a simple recognition that we are in a time right now of global sharing in real time of a lot of pain, right? And that pain sits on in different formats, in different ways, on really important and significant historical events. And not the least of this is actually European colonialism that has, you spoke of decolonizing the mind in a way, but and colonialism, not only in the European version perhaps, but also when I think of the history of Asia and other things, there have been colonial movements that are not necessarily European, but just the whole idea of infringing on people's loss, right? Stealing, in a sense, not just economic and financial prosperity, but also identity or personhood, as you describe it. And now that raises, and in this time, we have this amazing consciousness of it. And what do we do with it? And we can be agents of healing or not, right? If we succumb to building our own echo chambers, we may not be agents of healing, but perhaps in our own corners we can become those agents of healing. That's kind of what where I think there's a big story of a lot of pain, historically accumulated intergenerational pain, that we are only now becoming really aware of, which I'm amazed at, actually. And when I say we, I do great injustice, because there are many people who have always been aware of that, where that has been part of the historical legacy. But then there is this hopeful message around how can we actually authentically heal to repair and restore parity, equity, dignity, perhaps, besides economic loss. And I think the examples that you gave of the economic reparations, you started with Germany, which is of course very dear to my own context and background. And it's important that it's not just economic, right? That it's not just a payment of money and then we go on, but that we actually pair that with deep healing and equalizing ourselves, and when that doesn't happen, and it oftentimes doesn't happen, then the healing is incomplete. That's kind of what I'm taking away. Before we go to questions, I'd just love you to reflect a little bit whether that is a fair summary of what we're saying.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I think so.
Yeah. So then there's one question. The first question, I'll just pick a few. I mean, one is, what does it? Do you have a practical example? If we start in our corners, how can we put this into practice, especially the conscious reciprocity? And that's one question. And maybe that links to you said you had this your own example of engaging in the proper human sexuality build. Maybe that's an example, but I'm maybe not. So what would be a good example that helps us visualize what this looks like in action?
Yeah, maybe let me use that example, because it's a controversial one, and it's a difficult one in a country like Ghana, where we are predominantly Christian, at least by the statistics. And we in recent years, there's been a lot of moralizing discourse. So last year, there was a bill was proposed in Parliament. In short, I'll call it Proper Human Sexualities Bill. What it seeks to do is to respond to issues of same-sex relationships, possibly same-sex marriage, intersex, queer, a variety of identities that are not the same, but all put together into this bill. This was a private members' bill sent to Parliament, and the committee, the committee that addresses legal issues in Parliament, then invited memoranda from the general public in response to this bill, right? I mean, before that, of course, there were groups who spoke out for the bill and people who spoke out against the bill. Now, and among the groups who had commentary to make against the bill is a group called the Network for Women's Rights in Ghana that I belong to, and other groups. Some people belong to a number of different groups who submitted memoranda. And on a particular day, NetRight were invited to Parliament to speak to the memorandum that we had submitted. So 4 or 5 of us went, and I was one of those. Prior to this, and I identify as a Christian. I take my Christian faith very seriously. Before this, I had written an open letter. I forget what I titled it. I think I said that, I think the heading was something to the effect, why Christians should extend grace and not support the Proper Human Sexualities Bill. And I went into a number of reasons why I objected to the bill. The bill seeks to criminalize a lot of activities. Most of it is not implementable. It also seeks to make people report. It asks for corrective therapies for people who are gay and so on. So in that letter, I sought to indicate, in the way that I understand Christianity, why I didn't think that this is something that Christ that we follow would do. And I also talked about some of the legal issues in our constitution and so on. I didn't delve into that because others have done so. Long story short, there were people who attacked my credibility, who attacked my Christianity, who had, all kinds of personal attacks. Now, I give this example because, I knew that something like this would happen. And there were others who believed like me, but, I have a certain, what should I say? I have a certain platform that, as a university lecturer, who's a public intellectual. So, I can be given access to certain spaces. If I call one of my young men at a radio station, I can be invited to speak. So in that way, I'm employing my privilege, right? Yes. But at the same time, I am opening myself to attack from my Christian community because I am sharing an opinion that goes against the grain of many, or who will say, yeah, I agree with you on this point, but you shouldn't say it publicly. And if you are doing that, you are promoting a certain level of morality. And why are you juxtaposing rape and the fact that, a lot of men engage in adultery with this, 2 wrongs don't make a right, whatever it is. I give this example because it allows me for a tiny, tiny moment to walk in the shoes of a queer person, right? Something which I don't have to deal with. And in that tiny moment where maybe somebody, and I've had this kind of conversation in the past where somebody wrote in that, this was before social media, so it wasn't so bad, where somebody said, I must be sleeping with my female students, and this is why I'm speaking on behalf of queer people. But it allows me a tiny moment to experience what such a group experiences, and for us to engage in a conversation, open the floodgates, even though people don't want to talk about this, to put an agenda on the table and to, push people to look at the, intersectionalities in our society, and the fact that some of us are way more privileged because of our ethnicity, because of our religion, because of our class, and that this allows us to, look at a bill like this and take for granted a whole slew of things, which if for a moment you consider that, what if you were born intersex, right? What if you were born in a family where, people would actually throw you onto the street because you appeared to be too feminine as a male or too masculine as a female, even if you were not even gay, right? It's easier for some of us to do, because I know that if I lose my job, I have a husband who has a job, I'm not going to go hungry. But just a moment to share that experience, and the feedback that you get, sometimes negative and sometimes hateful, you can use it to generate energy to think even more deeply about other people's, areas of disadvantage.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting to talk about this idea that we use ourselves and our voice to step into the unspoken territories and into conflict and into tension, and that is a way, maybe a first step towards healing in a sense. But because first, it's like any wound that needs to be brought out in the open. It hurts at first, right? But then it requires other types of energies, maybe the energy of inclusive leadership, as I sometimes call it, to actually turn that into healing and positive momentum.
Exactly. And maybe, I think it's the leadership, Jörg, it's the leadership element that you referred to, that, inclusive leadership enables you to kind of see the different positions and compel, maybe compel is the wrong word, urge this dialogue. This dialogue is two-way. I don't know what the word is for multiple people in a conversation, but to urge that and to be the facilitator to make people listen to each other.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting because I oftentimes think that the essence of inclusive leadership is being a facilitator, facilitating through multiple perspectives, voices, first empowering them, right? And then facilitating through that to a place that is bigger than any perspective in and of itself.
It's uncomfortable. I don't know about you. It's uncomfortable work for me when I start, because I like people to like me, and I want people to be comfortable with me, and stepping into that facilitator role. Yes. This person is not happy with you for this, and the other person is not happy because they all want you in their corner, and you are trying to be the that voice that allows everybody, but they don't want you to allow everybody. And some people shouldn't be allowed. And so for me, it's sometimes uncomfortable. But when you push, I find that when I push myself, once I get started, then, it's like, okay, I've thrown myself in at the deep end. What can I do? I have to swim.
Yes, absolutely. You don't quite know what will happen, what's next, but yes, absolutely. And I think that requires a little more introspection and skill building for many people, right? How do I, and I think of so many leaders I know that are deeply uncomfortable with playing that role, or that are not thinking, but they think of leadership and their own leadership, that is part of it, right? Of getting immersed, getting into it actually, and making yourself sometimes the catalyst of the controversy or tension. But I have a question here that I think is important in the context of our audience. What's the role in this movement, in this, if I step back and look at the totality of your message, what is the role of business in this? And what is the role of business leaders in this story or in this? Because it seems to me that business oftentimes has sat is an extension of difficult colonial histories. Even you talked about the epistemic violence, which is a really interesting thing to think about in the pharmaceutical industry. So let's say if I were Novartis, or just to pick on one, or GlaxoSmithKline, or any pharmaceutical company of global multinational organization, and I really detect in these organizations a consciousness change on behalf of leaders as well, that are thinking about the broader purpose, healing and health, obviously being part of the story of the company. But if I'm sitting in one of those organizations as a leader, and I'm broadly supportive of this, and I understand these connections, how do we translate that into something that businesses and organizations can do? And I know this is a huge question to throw at you, and it may be very unfair, but
No, it's a very important question, and of course, I'm sure many of us, talk about it. And to say that we have to, let me throw out a cliche, and then I'll say something else. We have to dismantle the capitalist order. Let me say that. But I think that as a business owner, if I was a business owner, I would first have to recognize that I must take a hit in my super and supernormal profits, right? That I cannot continue to make profits at the scale that I was doing before, because I am going to be more ethical in the way that I deal with knowledge. It means that I'm not going to let's take pharmaceuticals. I'm not just going to parachute into a community, talk to some traditional healers, collect their herbs, take them into a lab. I'm going to make them co-owners of that product.
Yes.
If I'm going to make them co-owners of that product, then I'm sharing my profits among a larger group of people. And so I'm going to make less profit. So without the recognition that I'm going to have to earn less, I don't think that it is possible. But if in our and I'm like, sometimes I look at the amounts of money people make, and they can never spend it in 10 lifetimes. So, you even wonder why people have to make, such huge amounts of money. But if you go further to think about the intersectionality and reciprocity of it, truth of the matter is, truly, if my neighbor is doing well, I'm going to do well. And among the Akan, I was talking about this recently with a friend, and not to privilege any ethnic group, but among the Akan or the Asantes, and the Asantes are very profit motivated, very industrious, very interested in expanding their trade. And I'm simplifying here, but there's a certain recognition that if my nephew and my niece and my grandson and my neighbor are doing well, 20 years down the line, they're not going to be knocking on my door asking for a handout, right? Mm-hmm. So in a certain self-interested way, in investing in their well-being, I'm also assuring myself of a future that is not inundated with a whole slew of people that I'm obligated to look after, because in a community sense, you should not be letting people, fall off the grid. So again, it's like, giving someone a fish, helping them to fish, tomorrow you don't need to feed them. So if there was a way for the corporate world, to understand this, that the amount of money that is being spent on corporate social responsibility, which has now become a thing, once upon a time, there was probably a lot of ethics around it. Why would we need to do corporate social responsibility? Because the kids down the street would have a good school to go to. You wouldn't have to, build a school for them, because you would have empowered them to build their own school. So, fundamentally, if that thinking isn't there, and the huge profits are an end in and of themselves, then so it requires a major shift in thinking. And I think that you can be rich and you can be wealthy, without exploiting others, but you're not going to be that rich, and you're not going to own somebody else's country, right?
Sure.
You will not go in and buy their own their airports, as has happened in Zambia, because, that's an issue of sovereign identity. Yes. And, you can go in there and do business with them without, bringing them to their knees. And I really cannot see any other way, around this without that kind of recognition. And I dare say that there are many smaller businesses that have been able to do this. When they become, and I wish some of them would not sell, would not agree to be bought by, multi-billionaires, because then a company that was making hundreds of thousands or maybe $1 million which is definitely not poor, is taken over by a multi-billionaire who then feels that they need to, make huger profits, and then that company ceases to have that kind of consciousness or those kinds of ethical considerations.
Yeah, I mean, this is what conscious reciprocity might look like as a business system, right, or as an organizational system. It changes the logic why we do what we do and how we measure our success. But without it, I sense sometimes we are at that transformational moment at the moment where we can all contribute to making those shifts happen. Because there seems to be, I hope, I don't know if but a rising consciousness about these topics, which is why, this topic of intersectionality and collective healing, why we're talking about this actually today, because paralleled maybe to all these, the echo chambers and that you also described, I think there is a sense of that consciousness rising as well. That's maybe the hopeful part of me.
Well, we have to also generate hope, because otherwise, then why bother to do anything? Why bother to do inclusive leadership if you don't think it's going to lead somewhere, right? And the inclusive leadership that you do means that you are also sharing information, both to give hope, but also to give people actual tools to do the things that they are then hopeful about.
Yeah. Absolutely. There is one more question that is really too intriguing. I know we're almost at time, and anybody who has to leave, please, it's fully understandable. And I'm taking the privilege of having your time to just ask that question that came through. And it's a very specific question, because the topic of cultural appropriation is also very current, right? And people talk about this, and there is great discussion in the general discourse. And obviously, that was also part of the story that you laid out, of or whether it's the stealing of artifacts or the commercialization of cultural traditions, or the denial of some basic cultural aspects like funerals or so. But there is this increasing discourse around cultural appropriation, and I'm just wondering whether you have a particular opinion or perspective on that.
Yeah, it's again a difficult one. Who can appropriate? Who does a particular culture belong to, right? First of all, is the culture of X or Y. Whose culture is it? Where does it begin? How far back can we go to measure and to count? And who owns it and who has the right to use it, and so on. In the last slide that I shared, in the middle there was this symbol of two crocodiles, and
yes.
That symbol, I should have written the translation, that is an Edinkra symbol. Now, Edinkra symbols, they are proverbial, they are used to decorate buildings and cloth and so on, and they are messages. Now, these two crocodiles are sharing a stomach to show that, the crocodile, we know the crocodile eats. The crocodile is not a creature that we are excited to meet, because if it takes you, you are done for.
Yes,
you're in that. Putting them together in that wisdom was to show that you better do some adjusting to each other. Otherwise, you're not going to survive, right? Of course, we don't see two crocodiles sharing a stomach. So it's just a warning about our interconnectedness. So, and the reason I talk about this is because there have been some debates about who can use Edinkra symbols. The folklore board in Ghana says that nobody anywhere can use Edinkra symbols. The question some ask is, who owns those symbols? Some of this folk knowledge, as we might call it, we're not going to be able to go back and say, Kofi or Ama or Akosua created this particular symbol, right? Who owns it? So it becomes it becomes a dicey question. At the same time, we have also seen ways in which symbols, knowledge, artifacts that are sacred to particular people are employed in very dismissive ways by others who do not have any understanding, of that culture. So, it will be difficult to draw a line somewhere, but I would say that at a minimum, if you are going to make use of a saying, a proverb, a symbol, an artifact, a poem, whatever it is, at a minimum, you need to acknowledge where it's coming from. At a minimum, do some research to find out where is this coming from. Don't just see it as something that's aesthetically pleasing and employed, or that sounds, beautiful and employed. Do some minimum research and make sure that you are confident. Ask yourself that if this was you, this was your culture, you would be confident that you are employing it in a respectful manner, right? Beyond that, I think that one has to look at things on an individual basis and, try to learn whether a particular symbol that comes from a particular ethnic group is only used, for example, on grave sites. And so therefore, let me not put it as the clasp on my belt.
Yes.
But perhaps it is used in a community dance. And so therefore, if I employ it in a piece of music, it is not offensive, right? So, it means that you must do some homework to understand how it is used. And we'll not always get it right. I travel, I'm going to make this confession. I traveled once to Kenya. I had a young woman do some calligraphy with henna art on my body. I used Adinkra symbols. I did not pick symbols that I was not familiar with. But there were certain young ladies who, when I came home, they were like, this is cultural appropriation. And I said, I think that this is a bit of an exaggeration, but there will always be points of disagreement. And then we can have a conversation. And why do you think it's cultural appropriation? Okay, maybe you're right. Maybe you have a point. Or I think this is a bit of an exaggeration. And the person who did this, calligraphy on my body was fairly comfortable with doing it for me, and so on. But if somebody's offended, there are words in our vocabulary when we're children, they taught us, please, thank you, I'm sorry. They always need to be somewhere. If I have offended somebody unknowingly, I had no bad intentions, I can at least say, I am sorry, and I can avoid repeating that again in the future, right? We will never always get it right, but the sense of apologizing, seems to have left us. It's like if you apologize, you are weak. If you apologize, the other person is right. The other person has won. But we will never always get it right. And apologizing for where we have misstepped is a part of our own growth and our own learning.
Yeah. And probably also on the other side, right? When we feel particularly outraged as something, to at least pair our outrage with openness to learn, right? That there may be something that we're not understanding or seeing, because that enables that dialogue you spoke about. And without this dialogue at eye level, we probably can't heal. And
I'm so glad you said that, because there's so much outrage without any attempt to listen. And if you take out the people who are really just out, they are sociopaths, take out the sociopaths. They are people who genuinely did not intend to hurt, but they've done something hurtful, something very, very hurtful. Yes, your initial response is outrage. Maybe you sent a slew of tweets or whatever, which I would hope that we would not, because it's always best to simmer and to think before throwing everything into social media. But you did that. Now listen to, give the person, after all, we all want our day in court, give the person who committed the offense the opportunity to also, to share where they came from. And maybe you might move a little closer, to where they are coming from, and recognize that actually I committed the same offense, last week, right? Yes. In another context. And so I'm really glad that, it's not only about the offender, apologizing, it's about the offended listening to the offender and even creating the opportunity for the apology and forgiveness. Because if we carry that outrage and refuse to listen to the offender, how are you helping the offender not to commit that offense again tomorrow?
Absolutely. We're just switching roles, right? And exactly. That's not the solution either. Yeah. I know we are way over time. I really, really appreciate and of just being able to just lay this out. It's a story we are all implicated in somehow, right? The historical pain that frames our individual stories, biographies, and our individual pain as well. And we can become conscious, and we can take action of that are healing or not. And that takes us to our own attitudes, right? And that we need to cultivate. And so much stems from that. And I really appreciated the reminder, but also the reminder that we can't just sit with ourselves. We need to externalize what that internal attitude in our external actions. And otherwise, we're not changing at least our part of the world, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to travel, continue to travel this journey with you.